So, a quick review of where we've been from the past lesson. So you'll remember in our past lesson, we talked a little bit about science. We talked a lot about science. And we said, in essence, that science is one of those spaces that explores the material world. So this is not news to you. You know what the material world means and how it has been defined and shaped by us in this class. And you know that in the religious world, the material world is, of course, part of a larger set. So if we have essentially our material world here, then this is the world of matter, time, space, energy, interaction, all that sort of stuff. There it is right there. And then outside of that is the world, outside of that is the world of the supernatural. Okay, this is where Plato's infinite and eternal things dwell, where you find Aristotle's the God, right? And where religious believers generally understand there to be a reality that is other than, but no less real than, the material world in which we live. So that's sort of our Venn diagram in general. And you know that in our discussions, we've talked about how science is essentially locked into the material world. Okay. We said last week as well, just to review quickly, we said last week there's not really any conflict between science and religion. That doesn't exist on any large scale. And most people who are genuinely religious and most people who are genuinely religious and most people who are genuinely materialists would agree, okay, that if a religious believer is making a claim about some reality that is out here in the infinite and eternal realm, there is nothing science can say about that. Science doesn't have any access to anything except the material space. However, and this is where we will start today. However, we said that in that last uh, sort of understanding of religion, there is a kind of religious view that is, in Christianity, we have referred to it as fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism varies from religious tradition to religious tradition. So the fundamentalists that you will run into in Christianity are probably somewhat different from the fundamentalists you run into in the other monotheistic traditions in Judaism or in Islam. All of them have fundamentalisms, and all of them approach their fundamentalist views rather differently in different ways. We don't have time to unpack all of those. What we can say briefly is that in Judaism, generally fundamentalism in Judaism has to do with a specific set of practices. Okay, a particular and it's, of course, it's tied into their worldview and their thoughts about their scriptures, but it is about a sort of intense keeping of a specific set of laws, and that's because those laws are fundamentally rooted in a literalist interpretation of scripture. In Islam, we run into a fundamentalism that most of us in the sort of American, Euro-American sphere tend to think of in rather political terms. There's a lot more to the fundamentalist movements within Islam, and those are certainly worth exploring. But in a nutshell, we tend to contextualize Islamic fundamentalism as a sort of political or sometimes even radicalized terrorist group. When we talk about, Islamic fundamentalists, most Americans, the first thing that's going to pop into their mind is going to be something about terrorism. That's an unfair characterization, it's fair to say, of fundamentalism overall in the Islamic tradition, but it's part of our media and it's part of who we are. That's certainly true. Fundamentalism in Islam is a broader spectrum, and again, we're not going to try to unpack all of that here, but it's enough to say that there is also a kind of fundamentalism in Islam that is particularly focused not on political outcomes, but or political perspectives even, but on a kind of purity of soul. And that's another part of Islamic fundamentalism that gets very little press for us. So Christian fundamentalism, when we begin to think about the Christian view, there's the Christian view, and as we said, there's also a Jewish view of fundamentalism, and there's also an Islamic view of fundamentalism. But we're going to focus on the Christian view. All right, because that's the one that dominates our culture and it's the one that dominates our perspective. It's fair to say that in all of them, you will meet individuals for whom fundamentalism is a profound expression of a very, very interior pilgrimage. It's a kind of journey toward some aspect, some vision of a move toward a greater purity or a greater devotion. So I just want to make sure that we understand that when we talk about fundamentalisms, there's there's a broad spectrum of the fundamentalist. And yes, it gets mixed up in our politics. The fundamental Christian fundamentalism also gets mixed up in American politics as well, as we'll see. We'll touch on that briefly today. But in essence, what we've got is I want to be sure that we're looking at this correctly and in a big picture. And that big picture means that fundamentalism is often, for many believers, a sort of interior status that they hold on to or that they craft in order to purify and increase devotion to their faith tradition. So fundamentalism is, we're going to talk about fundamentalism today in terms of a kind of extremism. That's a fair academic classification, and I don't have any problem saying it. Fundamentalism is an extreme position. But that extreme position, you have to understand, is not something that is going to be easily, you can't turn it into a stereotype. And that's generally the fastest and easiest way to deal with fundamentalism is to very quickly stereotype it and then say, okay, now I know what I need to know about this. It's more complicated. All right, so that said, let's dive into fundamentalism a little bit more. We talked about it last time in regard to science, and we talked about fundamentalism as, in essence, a kind of fanaticism. So fundamentalists are not always fanatics. They're not always fanatics, but it is fair to say that when we study the fundamentalist world, people who we would identify as fundamentalists in any of the traditions, right? We tend to see people whose thought processes look a lot like fanaticism and sometimes are unquestionably fanatical. So, are all fundamentalists fanatics? No. Is fanaticism a very frequent aspect of fundamentalism? Yes. Okay, so maybe we should stop and talk a little bit about what fundamentalism is per se. We've already talked about it in the context of the rise of modernism. You know that the fundamentalist movement in Christianity in America, okay, so the American fundamentalist movement, that's what we're talking about right now. So American Christian fundamentalism. That'll be pretty much our focus from here on. So American Christian fundamentalism has a certain element to it, and that certain element it rises up in the early 1900s as a pushback to modernism. And one of the things that began to mark it historically was this insistence that the Christian in America needed to be pure and holy. Is that a fanatical view? No, it's not. It's nothing fanatical. I think most religious believers think they're supposed to be pure and holy, and they're supposed to pursue God with all their heart and all their soul and all their mind. That's a requirement in most religious faiths. That is a total dedication. But a total dedication to something does not make you a fanatical. So fanaticism is not total dedication. Okay. It's fair to say that the Pope is not going to become the Pope is not going to become a materialist tomorrow. The Pope is almost certainly totally dedicated to his Christian Catholic faith. And I know people who are almost certainly going to spend their entire life totally dedicated to a certain religious point of view. Total dedication is not fanaticism. Total dedication can happen without any hint of fanaticism. All total dedication means is, look, this is where I've concluded. I've drawn this conclusion, and I'm gonna go with that. Okay, so when fundamentalism arises in the early 20th century, it's pushing back against modernism, And as we would say, living in the postmodern era, correctly pushing back against modernism. Modernism had some real problems, right? There are deep flaws in modernism and its association with its idea that only the scientific method and pure rationality can lead human beings to good decisions. As it turns out, that's simply not true. Um, as we know now in the postmodern era, as we would certainly conclude in our era. So fundamentalists are they're the first postmodernists, if you want to think about them that way. They're pushing back and saying, no, there are other aspects to the world that your science and your calculation and your observation and your measurement is leaving out. You're leaving out God, and therefore we don't want to have anything to do with you. Okay, so that's the rise of fundamentalism in the early 20th century. If you wish to think of the fundamentalists, the Christian fundamentalists, in say the 1915 era, 1915 to 1920, as that movement is, and that's when the movement's arising. So as it's arising in there and it's pushing back against modernism, it's fair to say our friends, the Christian fundamentalists, are a kind of nascent postmodern. They're sort of proto-postmodernists because they're the ones who are saying this modernist thing is going wrong. Okay, where do they end up? Well, they end up in a very strange place. And in many ways, we would say they end up in a place that very much reflects, and this is a key idea, fundamentalism as it forms. They're trying to push back against modernism. And here's the crucial idea that we want to unpack in the next few minutes. While Christian fundamentalists are sort of proto-postmodernists, objecting to modernism as a kind of problem, they end up imitating all the problems that modernism offers. So fundamentalists, while they are pushing back against modernism and not all of modernism, you find fundamentalists that they don't have any problem owning cars or being on the telephone. Some do, some withdraw from all technology, but for the most part, they don't have a problem with contemporary technology, but they keep pushing back against these ideas that somehow modernism is secularism. It would be the fair thing to say that this sort of secular idea that is emerging out of the modern world, where we can account for everything without ever thinking or talking about God. That's what they're pushing back against. They're saying you're leaving out the most important part of human life, which is our relationship with the divine. Okay, so they're pushing back against modernism. But the crucial thing that we want to unpack here is that as they push back against modernism, they are often taking the very fundamental assessments that modernism has pushed onto the world, and they're buying into them. Hook, line, and sinker. So it would be fair to say that fundamentalism does not constitute a very effective challenge to the modernist ideas. So as modernism is growing, and we've talked about it in its, view of infinite progress and all of that, as modernism is growing, you get this pushback from these religious believers who say, well, wait a minute, you keep saying, hey, I've got it all figured out, and we don't think you do. We think there are mysteries out there that you don't understand, and we think there are realities out there that you're not looking at. Those realities in the infinite and eternal space out here, right? Okay, so therefore, we reject your modernist ideas. Here's why we reject them, and here's how we're going to move forward. And when we listen to the early fundamentalists talk about why they're rejecting modernism and how they're moving forward, when they get to that how they're moving forward, they're following exactly what modernism tells them to do. Okay, so let's see how that pans out. So the key here is that the Christian fundamentalists are sort of nascent. They're proto-postmodernists. They're pushing back against modernism. They're trying to put some pressure on modernism, and yet they end up being very modern in the end. Okay, so what is it that fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists in the United States in the 1920s and 30s, as they emerge and found themselves. What is it they believe? Okay, the fundamental thing that defines Christian fundamentalism in America in the 20th century is an absolute conviction that everything that is written in their sacred scriptures is to be taken literally. Okay, so what are their beliefs? Their beliefs are that literal readings of scripture are best. In fact, are only. These are the only ways to read scripture correctly. Okay. So literal readings of their sacred texts are the best way. In fact, they are the only way to read the sacred writings correctly. Okay. So if you want to understand the Bible correctly, you have to read it literally. Now, I will say that in that context, in 35 years, I've never met a single religious believer who thinks everything in the Bible is literally true. They recognize there are metaphors, they recognize there are, parables and that sort of thing. Most of the time, I mean, some of them dig their heels in and say, no, it's all literally true. But I don't think I've ever met anyone who stands by that claim that it's literally true in every particular. Very, very much. Very few people that I've met. What they tend to mean by this idea that there is a literal reading of the scripture and that is the best way to read the Holy Bible, or the only way to read the Holy Bible, is that they mean that especially the stories that are given in the Old Testament, what the Christian believers call the Old Testament, the old Jewish scriptures, those are to be taken as actual accounts of things that happened. Okay. So the parting of the Red Sea is not a metaphor, it's an event. Now, we talked about this briefly in regard to science. And the word that came up there was Ereignisglaube. Ereignisglaube is the belief that an event took place, that there was an historic happening. Okay. Had you been there, you would have seen it. It's not a story that explains a people's response or a people's understanding. It's a story that accounts for the event. It is an accurate telling of something. Okay, so when somebody asks, fundamentalists believe that you should approach all of the stories in the Old Testament with Ereignisglaube, with a faith, Glaube, faith, belief, in the event, that is that it existed as an historic happening. Okay. What that gets us to is, of course, the primary space that we run into tensions here is in the world of creation, in the world of God making reality out of nothing. Okay. So that's the problem that we run into with science when you exist. So those of us who are fundamentalists and look at the world from that point of view, they're the ones who are going to run into that problem with science. If you simply don't feel a need to say the Earth came into existence as pretty much as it is today, about 8,000 years ago, and it happened over about 150 hours. If you don't hold that, if you read the book of Genesis and you see a poem about God's relation to reality, and those are the stories you see, well, okay, then you just don't ever run into problems with science. But the fundamentalist does. The fundamentalist takes the stand that since this is a literal telling, it has to be an accurate description. That's what they mean by literal reading. This is an accurate description of events. Okay. So fundamentalism in that way, then we'll watch it sort of emerge in a kind of fanatical context. So fundamentalists rising in the 1915s, 1920s, they solidify and rally around this idea of the Bible being literally true. Infallible is sometimes the way they talk about it. But they use that term in a variety of different ways. But basically, they mean that everything in the Bible, the stories that are told in the Bible, are literally true. Now, many of the stories in the Bible are true, okay, or at least we have very strong evidence that there's some real backing behind that. So we know that there are accounts in there, particularly in uh, uh, certain texts that are in there. So the if you don't know, the Bible is divided into what are called various books. These books are written at different times. They come from very different authors across a wide range of cultural conditions. Some of them are written while people are literally, they've been deported. Their country's been destroyed, and they've been deported into a sort of quasi-slavery in some foreign land. Others are written, at the height of some sort of local kingdom that is pretty glorious and powerful in its time and in its place. So there's a whole variety of literatures that are out there. There's poetry. There's there are love poems. There's pretty racy erotic literature in there. There's all kinds of stuff, and they're all it's all put together and presented as an aspect of God talking to how the world works. Okay, what fundamentalists tend to do. So we know there are a lot of these things that are written down as people saying, "Hey, we're giving an account of what we understand God to be doing in our world through us right now." So they're telling stories about things that actually happened to them. We see that a lot. Others of those stories that you'll run into there, they just don't seem to fit into that genre. They look a lot like different kinds of genre. So you pick up the book of Job, which is a story of suffering in the Jewish scriptures. And there's nothing about Job that suggests any kind of attempt to create a historic event. In fact, Job begins with a sort of ancient pattern that is almost the equivalent of once upon a time there was a man, right? Um, so it's clearly intended, or the best literary analysis would suggest that the book of Job is intended as a kind of extended parable. It's written that way. It sounds like that. It looks like other extended parables and so forth. Um, so it doesn't, is the story true? Does it actually happen? The fundamentalist would say, yep, the book of Job, uh, spelled Job, the book of Job is real. It's an accurate description of a real person in history, and these things actually happened to him. Okay. Most people wouldn't buy that. But that's the kind of thing you run into in fundamentalism. So fundamentalism is taking essentially the genres of the scriptures, the sacred writings of Christians and of the Jews, the Christian Bible. They're taking the Christian Bible, and they are simply uh, the idea of genre just does not matter very much in fundamentalism. Okay, whether you're looking at Job or you're looking at the opening of Genesis or a dozen other scriptures, certain passages in the Psalms or whatever, you're not supposed to worry about whether or not this is a poem, or whether this is a history, or whether this is a group of maxims. It's all supposed to be literally understood. Okay. Since Christian fundamentalism has decided things are literally understood, then you can grasp where Christian fundamentalism begins to look like the fanatical. Okay, so we've described the fanatical in here. You know that there is a world, there's a kind of evidence that leads to certainty. This is all very familiar, I hope. There's a kind of evidence that leads to faith or conviction. And there are sources, we wouldn't really call them evidence, but there are sources that lead to our preferences, our desires. All right. And you know that logos, pathos, and ethos are what leads to this world. Logos, pathos, ethos, that's what leads to the world of conviction. And you know that observation, measurement, and calculation That's the sort of stuff that leads to certainty. And you know that mood and basically genetics, etc., all these other things, that's what leads to our particular desires and preferences. You know that in the world of the fanatic, what will happen is they will take the evidence. So the fanatical view will take the evidence that should lead to a conviction, and they will treat it as if it led to certainty. That's the hallmark of the fanatic. They will also take their own preferences, their own moods, their own sense of the world, and they will treat that as if it were evidence that you needed to take into account when you form your convictions. That's what fundamentalism will frequently do. Also, fundamentalism will take evidence that you present and they will demote it. So when you present hard, fast evidence that the world is certainly more than 8,000 years old, the fundamentalists will take this and will, in fact, treat that as saying, well, I could see how a person might think that. And they'll treat that evidence as if it leads to conviction rather than certainty. Likewise, when you present a good case for a position, that will be demoted to your own private, personal point of view. Okay, so we see this going on inside frequently. We frequently see this going on when we have fundamentalist believers who are, in essence, making claims about the natural world. Okay, and those claims about the natural world are mechanistic claims. They're claims about how nature happens, how nature came to be. Things that should be in the realm of science, they assume they have a better explanation because their explanation comes from the sacred texts, which they are reading literally. Okay? So that's the process, and that's usually what the fundamentalist believes. Now, I said earlier, fundamentalism tends to essentially push back against modernism, but it falls prey to modernism. Let's talk about that a little bit more. And then we're going to talk about the ramifications of the fundamentalist, and we'll talk then about extremism more generally. Okay, so back to our scheme here, you know that there is this world in which there is certainty and there is conviction and there's preference. All right, so we're going to get rid of our fundamentalist, or our rather fanatical eras here, and we're just going to take these as they stand. Okay, so there's observation, measurement, and calculation leads to certainty. Logos, pathos, and ethos leads to conviction, confidence, faith, and your mood leads to what you want. Okay. What happened in the modern world, you will remember, I will refer you back to that handout that you had a few weeks ago, the intellect redefined. You know that in the old world, this was considered intellect. We're talking about before the modern world. This was the intellect. This was half of the will, what you wanted, and then the other half of the will was basically what you decided. And then there's memory down here, which we'll talk about in our next lesson. Okay, here's what happened in modernism. I'm just reminding you, you should know this. You should have reviewed this in your, in the handouts that came out. Intellect Redefined, go there, review that handout. One of the things that modernism did is modernism said, yeah, intellect doesn't reach down to your convictions. That's not really an intellectual activity. If you cannot absolutely prove something through the scientific method with observation, measurement, calculation, if you can't absolutely prove it, then really there's kind of a wall between you and intellect, because intellect is about certainty. It's about knowing absolutely. So your convictions, your faith, your beliefs, that's not really intellectual. So where's it come from? Well, hey, look, it's a free world. You can believe anything you want as long as you just don't claim it's true. It's fine. As long as you don't claim you know, as long as you say, as long as you admit you can't be certain, then what have you got? You've got your own convictions, and your convictions are essentially privately framed, privately owned, privately built, and they can be whatever you want. I don't care what you believe. You can believe anything you want to believe. And so conviction becomes associated with your preferences. It's a private affair, a private matter. That's what faith is. Faith is a private, personal desire. It's what you want to believe, it's what you prefer. All of that. That's belief. Okay, it fits into the same category. So your beliefs about God and so forth, all of that fits into the same category as somebody who is trying to decide whether or not they're going to have, French fries or onion rings. It's just whatever, it's up to you. Whatever you prefer, you choose, and that's your belief. Now, what happens here is, and you've got to see this in the larger context, what we want to look at this carefully. What happened here in modernism, so this was the modern move, right? If you wish, the modern move. Now, again, we're painting with big brushes here, but the modern move essentially was to take this world of conviction and to say, well, that's just a matter of your personal preference because it's not part of the intellect. Why? Because we know what the intellect is, and the intellect is things we can observe and measure and calculate and be absolutely certain about. That's intellectual activity. And you want to say, oh, there's a God or there's no God. Okay, it's fine. But you can't prove that. And so it's just a personal choice. It's a private preference. Okay, so once conviction is taken out of the world of intellect, we run into all kinds of problems. Okay. Um, if you want to know more about those problems, come take COMS 167 next semester. Okay, we'll talk a lot more about these problems. Why does modernism cause problems? Why do we need postmodernism? Because modernism's really, really got some problems. But you can begin to sense what some of those problems are here. Basically, the thing that is the thing that accompanies modernism is they also go down here and they say, hey, you know what whatever you're gonna make a decision about, when you're gonna decide something, we're gonna use science to make decisions. That's the only thing that can guide your decisions. Why would you base your decisions on something like, oh, I believe this? When we can root our decisions in certainty and things we absolutely know. The problem, of course, is that certainty, um, and the methods we use to get certainty are in the end, they are in the end amoral. Observation, measurement, and calculation don't care what you're measuring or observing or calculating. There's no moral guidance. So there's no real help in trying to figure out whether or not you should do anything. We'll unpack a little bit more of that in our next lesson. But I hope you get a sense of how modernism causes a problem by taking essentially rhetoric, because this is what rhetoric is, right? Rhetoric is just building convictions using enthymemes. Enthymemes are just, combinations of clear reasoning and human experience and emotion and proven authorities. We just shuffle those around to create a good case for why you should believe something. Okay. Once we say, well, that's not really an intellectual activity, then we have a really hard time justifying moral claims like you should not own other human beings. That's a problem, right? You should not, uh, uh, engage in genocide. I mean, these larger moral claims about how we're going to live together, they run into a lot of problems once we sever conviction. We demote it, which modernism does. Modernism demotes the world of conviction, rhetoric. Uh, it kicks it out of the world of intellect. It says that doesn't count as intellectual activity anymore. That's not thinking about the world. That's just you figuring out what you want to believe and think. Okay. This is our problem. This is what modernism gives us. Now we're on a kind of sustained argument here, so let's make sure we're following. Fanaticism, we have said, is this belief that there is an absolute certainty to scriptures, that it tells us exactly what is there, that it is an accurate accounting. So in many ways, if we take the Bible, let's just call it the Bible over here, and understand we mean, Protestant Christian scriptures. If we take the Bible, one of the things that is the mark of the fundamentalist is that the fundamentalist begins to say, well, the Bible is how you get to certainty. I know with certainty this is true because it's in the Bible. That looks suspiciously like modernism. Modernism, remember, stopped saying, hey, you know what's valuable in the world? Before modernism, what's valuable in the world? Well, the things we can know with certainty, man, that's really important. And also the things we can understand as really well supported by human reason and human experience and human authority. Our authority, our proven authorities that can give us good guidance. That's really valuable too. So we need to work in the world of certainty, and we need to work in the world of confidence, conviction, faith. Bring those together. That's what makes a really good whole human life. Okay, great. Modernism said, no, no, no. The only thing that counts as a really whole human life is certainty, absolute certainty. Okay. Our fundamentalist friends in the early 20th century said, well, certainty is the only thing that matters anymore. Where am I going to get certainty? Oh, the Bible will give me certainty. And so they kind of buy into the idea that certainty is the only thing that matters. There's not really room for anything except being certain about what the Bible says. Okay. So that's the first step where we begin to see fundamentalism imitating modernism. Now, again, fundamentalism is a proto-postmodern movement. It's rejecting modernism. At least it's trying to reject modernism, but it opens its rejection of modernism by embracing the idea that certainty is what we're after. Certainty isn't what we're after under the old models. Before modernism, we were after a blend. We were after a cooperative adventure in human living that embraced both certainty and faith. Faith in the broad sense, certainty and conviction, right? So the fundamentalists say, well, this gives certainty, the Bible. They buy into certainty as the only thing that counts. So that's one way in which fundamentalism begins to imitate the modern world. And then, ironically, fundamentalism will also imitate the modern world by, at the same time, saying these convictions I privately, personally am confident of, know to be true because they are my experience. So we don't see fundamentalists ever introducing enthymemes. Or if they do, they introduce very constricted enthymemes that look a lot like fanaticism. Okay, so their use of enthymemes looks pretty fanatical in the early 20th century. They may make a case, they can put together a case that says, oh, look, science doesn't answer everything. Therefore, we know positively that. They're constantly promoting their evidence. Okay, so they're imitating modernism because they are valuing certainty. But then they also, at the same time, buy into modernism's reduction of conviction to a private, personal choice. So they are also saying that this is a private affair. I have personally had an experience. Well, that's fine. Good for you. Bully for your experience. That's this right here. Okay. That's what modernism said. Yeah. Your beliefs, your faith, that's a matter of whatever your preferences is. If you have those experiences and feelings, good for you. They begin to champion this idea that their goal in life is this private personal experience. Now, we've seen that in evangelicalism. That should go back. You should hear echoes of the Cane Ridge revival in Kentucky in 1802. The whole Second Great Awakening, the move of the Second Great Awakening, all of that should echo in your mind. Evangelicalism emerges in that same time. Fundamentalism is a split in the evangelical movement, and all of them are emphasizing private experience, personal, private decisions. This is in many ways an imitation of this modernist view that reduces your faith to your private preference. Now, let's not push this too far. The Christian history has always emphasized a necessity for the person, the individual, to have a change, or at least to grow in a certain kind of experience of God. Okay, so that's always been in Christianity. But this is an emphasis now on a private understanding and a private interpretation, a personal preference for reading the Bible one way or the other. So they're buying in at one level, they're buying into this reclassification, if you will. The fundamentalists are buying into this reclassification of faith as a matter of private preference. Okay. Meaning they stop making a case. They stop, they're constantly doing appeals. You should come join us. You should get right with God. You should ask Jesus into your heart. You should be born again. All of the standard phrases. They're doing that. So they're evangelizing. That's true. But they stop saying, what we're saying is large enough that it applies to everyone. They stop making a case that they have a moral truth that is that should change things. Now the evangelicals keep making that case. They keep pressing that. Remember, it's the evangelicals who back the abolitionist movement that ends slavery. Okay, in the United States, it's evangelicals are behind the prohibition. All right, which is which is an attempt to reduce domestic violence. Okay, the larger social frame, they want to reduce domestic violence, and they're quite successful in that, moderately successful in that. So the evangelicals are still very much engaged and very much committed to this idea that I live this gospel truth, this relationship with Jesus, and it is supposed to go out and change the world around me. What we increasingly see is fundamentalism withdrawing. The fundamentalists, to some measure, the evangelicals, but mostly it's the fundamentalists in America in that period from 1920 to about 1940 that increasingly withdraw from public life, and they stop making the case that we're here to change the whole society. They begin to withdraw, and they begin to talk in very what we would call apocalyptic terms. They begin to talk about how the world is going to end and Jesus is going to come back soon. And the important thing is not to try and fix the world. The important thing is to get your faith right. Okay. So we begin to see the rise of fundamentalism in the early 20th century. It is a proto-postmodern movement, it would be fair to say. It's a movement that looks at modernism and says, no, you got all kinds of problems here. You're not getting the full picture, which is exactly what we're going to say in postmodernism, by the way. Modernism did not get the picture. They left too much out. But then the fundamentalist response to that tends to trap them in a very modern view. They tend to treat their own faith as a matter of personal preference and conviction. Yes, they say everybody should be saved, everybody should have this experience, but they don't ever get around to giving any reasons for it. They just make emotional appeals for people to do that. Again, broad brushes. Okay, broad brushes here. But the other thing is that fundamentalism roots itself in the the champion of the age, which is certainty. And they begin to say, oh, the Bible is my source of certainty. And so they buy certainty. And they move away from, ironically, they're moving away from faith. Because faith, by definition, can't be certain. Right? Faith, by definition, is rooted in a conviction, in an understanding, and is always incomplete. So the fundamentalists tend to buy into this idea of certainty. All right. That's the rise of fundamentalism, and that's sort of fundamentalism until you get into the middle of the 20th century. You'll see fundamentalists sort of slowly drawn back into the public sphere because of World War II. Many of them will not. They will just see that as evidence that the world is in fact coming to an end, and they'll withdraw more. Many of them, however, will be brought into the sort of political realm a little bit more because of the all-encompassing nature of the Second World War. And then slowly they'll find their way back into some political motions, usually starting in about 1975 when Jimmy Carter, who is not a fundamentalist, but is an evangelical Christian, openly evangelical Christian, runs for and is elected as president. And then that begins a very different kind of shift in the evangelical and fundamentalist world. That shift, if we want to do that just very briefly, here's what that shift looks like. So the fundamentalists, review quickly to get us there. Fundamentalists, kind of pushing back against modernism, but they fall into a sort of modernist trap because they don't say, hey, what we really need to do is value conviction and faith. What they do is they say, I've got a Bible and it gives me certainty. So they begin to act like modernists. Even though they're trying to push back against modernism, they act like modernists. They simply choose a different and arbitrary authority and say, no, this is what gives us absolute certainty about the world. It's the Bible, it's not the scientific method. Well, that's an imitation of modernism, not a real dismantling or deconstruction or overcoming of modernism. So they value certainty. But generally speaking, they also find themselves talking about faith as a matter of private preference. And so they withdraw. Okay. And that withdrawal is something that goes on through a large part of the 20th century, not the entire 20th century, but a large part of it. And slowly they're drawn back into the world of the larger political tensions in the world because of World War II. And then, there's still another lull until you get into the middle 70s. In the middle 70s, evangelicals and fundamentalists decide that they want to participate more robustly in the political process because here's one of their own. Jimmy Carter is one of their own. He is a born-again believer, and he's running for president, and he's elected president. And that begins, so that catches us up. That's the summary. That catches us up to this moment. What happens next with evangelicals and fundamentalists? Very briefly, throughout the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s, evangelicalism aligns itself increasingly for a lot of different reasons with the Republican Party. And evangelicalism becomes an important voting bloc within the Republican Party. It's what helps the Republicans turn the South. The South had always been Democratic for years and years and years until Ronald Reagan. He's the one who captures the evangelical vote away from Jimmy Carter, by the way, who the born-again believer. The evangelicals abandon him when he runs again. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected with evangelical support. So then the evangelicals become a sort of power play inside the political landscape of America. We'll watch them over 35 years. They will continually reinforce and sort of double down on that participation. There are lots of people warning them not to do that, saying this is not what we're supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be aligned with a party. We're supposed to be proclaiming the kingdom of God, and that's not a partisan event. But increasingly, as the old saying goes, if you mix religion and politics, you get politics every single time. And so eventually we come to a place where now today we have people who call themselves evangelicals, who are Hindu. We have people calling themselves evangelicals who literally do not go to church. They've never, like once a year, they tell us that they're occasionally in a church. They don't know anything about the Bible. They when they say they're born again, what they mean is that they have been won over to a certain political cause. So evangelicalism itself, we don't really have a functional definition anymore for evangelicals. The people that we used to call evangelicals and the people that we used to call fundamentalists, they're still out there, but there are fewer of them. And the term evangelical doesn't capture what they're doing anymore because by now it's not fair to say it's exclusively, but it is certainly, it has a very strong, the word evangelical, the word fundamentalist, these have very strong political connotations today and accurate political connotations. Okay, so when somebody says I'm an evangelical, it doesn't necessarily mean they believe anything particular about Jesus. It used to. In 1977, 1980, 19, even as late as 1990, 2000, if somebody said I'm an evangelical, we knew that meant that they had certain kinds of beliefs about Jesus. They didn't all agree, but they believed certain things. And Jesus was a big part of their life. And they would be in church at least 10, 12 times a year. Most of them went to church at least weekly. And many, many of the evangelicals, people who were evangelicals, went to church 2 or 3 times a week. And that just simply vanished over 25 years. So from 2000 until now, none of those apply. So if a person says they're evangelical, it tells us almost nothing about how they practice the rituals of their faith. It tells us nothing about whether they have any particular faith in a world outside of politics. So it's a very weird time to try and be figuring out how evangelicals are involved in politics, because that word evangelical, the word fundamentalist, it means very little anymore that we can make use of. So that gets us caught up to speed with where evangelicalism and where fundamentalism goes from the opening of the 20th century until here we are, a quarter of the way through the 21st century. So over the last 125 years, that's kind of where they've gone. Okay. So with that summary in place, we're now ready to push back a little bit more about this idea of fundamentalism, fanaticism, and radicalization. So you know what fanaticism is now. Fanaticism is basically taking the worlds of evidence that exist, logos, pathos, and ethos, related to conviction, observation, measurement, and calculation related to certainty, and just simply the fanatic simply promotes their own evidence and demotes yours. That's the way it works. Okay. What is radicalization? Okay, radicalization is a little bit different. So if we move now from fanaticism, so we've been looking at fanaticism, and if we move from there to radicalization, zation, radicalization, Tion. There we are. So if we move from fanaticism to radicalization, we're looking at a real different scope. Radicalization tends to always involve, what a what a bad way to say that. Radicalism usually brings about action. So fanaticism is often about an attitude. Okay, it's often about the ability to, that's how we define it essentially. It's the ability to handle evidence. And usually the ability to handle evidence in a way that presupposes an outcome. Fanaticism is not interested in finding out what's so, it's interested in making a case that supports me. So let's think about that, because we're going to run into fanatics in other cases, in other spaces in our next couple of lessons. But fanaticism is not interested in finding out what is true. Okay. Fanaticism starts with the assumption that I know what's true and I got to build a case to support it. So basically, fanaticism tends to be interested in power. It tends to want to make your case weaker and my case stronger, even when I don't have the evidence to do it. That's the mark of fanaticism. It operates outside of the limits of its evidence. Now, can you make a good case for, religious conviction? Of course. I mean, we've seen that done this whole semester, right? I mean, religious people get a good shake in this class because there are a lot of smart evangelicals, smart Catholics, smart Orthodox, smart Jews, smart Muslims, a lot of smart religious people out there, and they make really good cases for their cause. No problem. We accept that. They're in the intellectual field, they're playing the intellectual game, they're providing evidence, they're making arguments, and they're good arguments, and we take them seriously. Absolutely. But fanaticism isn't in that category. Fanaticism doesn't make good cases. It starts from, let's put it this way, it appears almost insecure about its own conclusions, and so it doesn't want to entertain challenges. It has to constantly dismiss or push aside challenges rather than face them head on. So fanaticisms. Now, I'm talking here about religious fanatics. We're going to talk about political fanatics in the next lesson. So, I'm not beating up here on religious people. I'm beating up on fanaticism, okay? Fanatics tend not to work with evidence well. So evidence is not something they either that they know how to handle or that they have skill in handling. They don't tend to work well with evidence, okay? And they tend not to consider alternatives. They are locked into a conclusion that they've already drawn very frequently. Now, that's very different from being convinced. So let's be sure we get this right. Being convinced, having a conviction, is not fanatical. I can start with conviction. You have convictions. I have convictions. We've all got faith conclusions about God, about politics, about relationships. We got them. Okay. We have drawn conclusions and we've got reasons. The question is, can you talk about those reasons? And if I challenge you and if I show you that your reasons aren't good, are you willing to say, oh, wow, I got to rethink? If you undercut some of my reasoning, am I going to be able to go, oh, wow, hold on, I need to reconsider? If that's what's going on, you're not a fanatic. Fanaticism is not having convictions. Fanaticism is an unwillingness to entertain evidence. Okay, so it is, at some level, an insecurity. If you're conviction, if you're really confident, you don't mind challenges because you're like, okay, that's good. Let me think about that. The fanatic is constantly going back and undermining evidence rather than embracing it. Okay, radicalization now. Now, again, that's fanaticism, and fanaticism is prevalent across the political spectrum and across religious views. There are fanatical atheists. There are fanatical everythings. Okay, so fanaticism is not limited to religious belief. But do we find fanatics who are religious? Of course, a lot of them. Okay. Many of them? Most of them? No, probably not. Probably not. But are they there? Yes, absolutely. So that's fanaticism. Fanaticism is a failure to handle evidence honestly. Okay. Fanaticism is a failure to handle evidence appropriately and honestly. So evidence is not handled honestly or appropriately. All right. It is not handled honestly and appropriately. Okay, now let's talk about radicalization. We see that fanaticism is rooted essentially in evidentiary concerns about how people look at, examine, weigh, critique, and present evidence. Radicalization tends to be different. Radicalization is present in some religious contexts, but religious people can certainly be radicalized. But radicalization is also something that we see in a variety of political contexts. So if fanaticism, we said, fanaticism is not limited to religious people. I can show you, I can show you fanatical anythings, right? You find an ism and we'll find some fanatics in there. They're not hard to find. Radicalization becomes quite different. Um, Radicalization is more likely to occur in a political frame than it is in a religious frame. Probably. We don't have huge data on that, but generally speaking, one could make the case. Let's put it that way. Don't build don't bet the farm on this, but one can certainly make the case that radicalization is more likely to occur in a political context than a religious context. What's the difference between radicalization and fanaticism? Radicalization acts, and it is essentially action that is rooted in an ideological differentiation. So we make differences. We group people into different sets. Okay, that's ideological differentiation. Differentiation is people grouped into different sets based on our ideology. So ideological differentiation that creates a valuable in-group and a less valuable out-group or set of outgroups, leading to a kind of dehumanization of that other person. So there are actions that are taken in radicalization. So radicalization involves doing something. It's not just it's not just an attitude. It's an attitude that's leading us very quickly toward actions, or at least very definitely toward actions. What are those actions going to be based on? They're going to be based on ideology, and that ideology will now there are ideologies that are not radical. So don't read the word ideology here as all encompassing. There are certainly radical ideologies, and many ideologies are radical, but certainly not all ideological views are radical. Okay. But radicalization is action that flows from an ideology that differentiates groups, and groups of people, right? That differentiates groups into the in and the out. And the in group is us, the people who are pure, at least ideologically pure. And the out group is them, the people who are impure. They are against us. They are impure at some level. They're not real Americans, or they're not true communists, or they're not actual capitalists. So there's a true us, a pure us, and then there's them. This in and out has attention to it. They are a problem. We are not. And therefore, actions have to be taken. So this distinction. Now, look, everybody knows. Look, I'm married to a German. I can tell you up front, Germans and Americans are different. Okay, we're very different. Absolutely. And Americans see things one way, Germans see things another way. It's a radical difference. That doesn't make me a radical. Okay. So recognizing differences isn't what radicalization is based on. Radicalization is based here in this world where there is purity on our side and corruption on their side. Okay. That's the distinction. When we begin to say that group of people isn't valuable. So this radicalization, this in and out grouping, leads to a dehumanizing process. And that dehumanizing is something that will it can turn very dark and very violent very quickly. Okay. That dehumanizing essentially is a process that will deny, in the end, it will deny the equal application of universal rights and dignity. So it is an inning and outing of groups of people that dehumanize the outgroup and leads to their denial of universal human rights, we would say, universal human rights and human dignity. That's radicalization. So I hope you see a pretty clear distinction between fanaticism, which is not good, okay, and radicalization, which is really dangerous. Now, can fanatics be radicalized more easily than others? That's a really great question. Intuitively, my gut level would say absolutely, man, fanatics can be radicalized much more quickly than anyone else. But honestly, we don't have a whole lot of data and study to back that up. On the other hand, if a person is not very well skilled in handling evidence, if they do not, as we see in fanaticism, if they do not simply know how to use evidence, and if they aren't aware of their own conclusions as a sort of a sort of a tentative act of faith. Confidence, I've got. Conviction, I'm here. I'm ready to live on this. I'm ready to die on this. But can I tell you that it's absolutely certain? No, I can't do that. But boy, I got good reasons. Do you want to hear them? I can give them to you. And if you want to challenge them, I'm open for being challenged. That's great. A fanatic doesn't do that, right? They don't recognize that what they've got is faith. They want to treat it as certainty. Okay, is that a person who doesn't know how to deal with evidence very well? Is that a person who is more likely to end up being radicalized? I mean, I can't imagine that they couldn't be radicalized more easily. But that's the difference between radicalization. Radicalization is a group. If you're a radical, you're ready to take action. Okay? And that action will be based on an ideological differentiation of groups where we are right and they are wrong, and that they is a dehumanizing process. It's not a disagreement. It's those people don't do it right. By it, I mean be human. They're not really, they're after destruction and mayhem. They are evil. They are wicked. They deserve what's coming to them. And I'm going to make sure they get it. They are dehumanized, and there is a process through which you deny equal application of human rights and human dignity to that outgroup. That's radicalization. Okay. That's fanaticism. That's radicalization. Is radicalization religious? Yes, sometimes it is. Okay. Often we see in radicalized groups, we see violence being taken against the members of the group. So if you think of Jim Jones, you don't know Jim Jones probably. He was a religious cult leader who led a group of people down to build a utopia in the jungle. He was also kind of all the indications are he was a criminal. He was, smooching money from people and stuff. Uh, and when the authorities began to close in on him, basically he gathered all of his people together and he poisoned them. Now, most of them, as far as we can tell, willingly poisoned themselves and their children. They killed themselves and they killed their children. So sometimes in religious radicalization, you will find people willing to do violence to themselves and the members of their own group to show their purity. They sacrifice themselves as an example of the pure sacrifice. Um, okay, that's one way of thinking about it. Radicalization is also, however, more often likely to target other people that need to be poisoned. Okay, and there is a willingness to act to take away their rights and to deny their dignity. That's radicalization. Okay, enough with fanaticism, enough with radicalization. Let's talk a little bit about where we're going to go next. All right. In our next lesson, you're going to have two videos to watch. Okay. One of them is a video that introduces the idea of theory a little bit more deeply than we've dealt with before. I need you to watch that video first. and I'll post this in order. Let's watch that video on theory, and then we're going to follow that up with a video like this, where we're going to dive into that theory a little bit more and talk about that in the context of memory. And then, in that next and final lesson, we will talk about your final examination. I'll give you the review for that, and everything will be up and running. Okay, that covers it for this lesson on fanaticism and radicalization. And we'll see you next time, where we'll talk about memory and theory. Remember, theory, to see, and memory, to recall. So these two are obviously going to go together in some very, very powerful ways. All right. All the best. We'll see you next time.